The role of the CMO is ultimately about driving enterprise value.
Marketing changes every single goddamn day.
We're like on the hook for everything.
This idea of vision maker and integrator is such a really powerful one.
We should adopt in marketing more finance-based models.
It's really a good opportunity to have decision-based frameworks that allow us to actually tie things back to attribution and value. If anyone reads the headlines, agencies are dead. Marketing is dying. What are we doing? AI is rewriting everything, right? In-housing is happening, but yet marketing budgets are climbing. The projected annual growth spend for advertising is set to hit $1 trillion in 2026, according to a study by Group M. So really what we're doing today is we're going to talk about why that we think that is, what's happening, what's breaking, and despite all this doom and gloom, there are some lights at the end of the tunnel. Joining me today is Terry Seitz, ex-Visa marketing exec and brand advisor. We're unpacking the CMO's identity crisis and how that mirrors the shakeup across the entire marketing and agency ecosystem. Terry, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
Marketing, right? Let's talk about that because, back in the day, everyone used to think it was easy, right? It was like, well, you run a campaign, you run some ads, you get some sales. Great. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case, right? I think CMOs used to own awareness. Now they're expected to own demand, retention, customer experience, data analytics, and even technical stacks, MarTech, for example. And guess what? They don't own any of the P&L. So, it's really no surprise to me, that the average tenure of a CMO is just over 3 years, which even that feels quite long, given some of the conversations I've had and seen in the past. So, it relates to kind of one real issue, which is, what is the role of the CMO today? And how has that evolved given the fact that the tenure for these roles and positions seems to be changing consistently?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something I've written a lot about and thought a lot about over the last couple of years, and it's got some parallels to my career journey. But the role of the CMO, or the role of marketing, right? The role of the CMO as the leader of the function, is ultimately about driving enterprise value. We're going to probably talk a lot about today about some finance and some academic stuff, but really that's what we are all in the business of doing, right? Driving the value of a company, right? Or in the public markets, a company's valuation. And there's basically 3 ways you do it. You do it through growth, which is acquisition and increasing the lifetime value of a customer or consumer. You do it through profit, which is the combination of price and cost, right? You max the former, you minimize the latter. And risk, which we're going to talk a lot about, which is about earning stability and unexpected outcomes, which are, sort of unrealized revenue events and opportunities. That sounds really simple, but I feel like, to your very good provocation, we've sort of like lost that North Star because the evolution of the CMO is still very much in, not going to say in doubt, but very much an open question where, 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, to go back to John Wanamaker, we were in the business of basically doing advertising and communications, and he positing that 50% of our dollars are wasted. We just don't know what 50%, right? The world has changed. The tectonic plates under us have changed, and the remit has changed such that we should be all about driving that enterprise value, but we are seen as the folks that put out campaigns and logos and new positionings every 3 years, to your very good point about when we change when we change someone in that seat. We've sort of like lost that thread, and we need to get back to it. We need to own the 4 P's of price and promotion and product and place. And I'm not sure that we are, to be honest.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a statement Scott Galloway said, which was many years ago, it was the CMO's role to basically make the logo bigger, right?
Yeah.
It's now like changed to driving sales and attribution and margin and all these other things, right? Which, going back to the point I think I was making earlier, how much control, how much ownership does a CMO really have over some of those areas? You know, thinking about pricing, right? Pricing has a direct correlation to sales. If it's priced really high and we don't have a good marketing strategy, and people aren't going to buy the product, right? And so same for sales itself, right? Like, how are we actually generating sales? Who's selling the product? Is it e-commerce? Is it retail? You know, are we in an omni-channel world now where the attribution across all of these sales channels is so wonky? Who really owns the sales function and sales process? And I think, you know, it's very easy for a business to point its finger and go, well, it's marketing's fault, right? Because I think typically marketing has had the biggest challenge in figuring out how to actually showcase the value of what we're bringing in relation to some of those areas, whether it's price, whether it's revenue, margin, etc. And so I think the role of the CMO now is less about kind of marketing and more about how I would think of it as a mini CEO role, right? So, yeah, I think the CMO has to have like a COO mindset. They have to have an operational mindset. They have to have a finance mindset. And I think the expectation is too great. And I think that's why we're seeing the tenure kind of changing, because marketing changes every single goddamn day. But it doesn't feel like the organizational design systems that were put in place for these CMOs has evolved to meet and match the standards. So unfortunately, I think a lot of CMOs are set up to fail from the beginning, because they're not really given ownership over a very specific area or topic or subject or any P&L that they can really own themselves. Aside from the ones the CMOs who have become CEOs, i.e. our Mary and a few others from McDonald's and so forth. On that note, you know, what do you think, CMOs should be owning, right? There's this whole conversation about demand versus brand, and, you know, where do you think the CMO kind of should take that ownership and how?
A wonderful question. What we should own are those three pillars that drive the value or the enterprise value of a company. We should own growth, so acquisition and lifetime value. We should own profit, which is, again, that combination of price and cost. You talked about pricing power, and we can certainly get into that. And then we should own risk, both mitigating and optimizing. We don't currently. It's an unfair indictment of CMOs. To your very good earlier point about, we're like on the hook for everything, but we don't measure ourselves against those things. And so we get indicted for being the pixel people who develop marketing and communications. And therefore we're then sort of like put in a box. And so it's not surprising that the tenure of CMOs is so low, because they being the board, C-suite, finance go, we don't really understand what you're doing. And you haven't done a very good job selling us on your contributions. And so there's misaligned expectations from the get-go. But we should absolutely be in charge of those growth, profit, risk levers. But we have to prove our ability to go press them in the appropriate ways. And so I feel like that's been an expectation and design failing that you rightly point out. There was an HBR article that just came out about that very subject, where they talk about, well, there's three different types of CMOs. There's the one that owns the enterprise value. There's a corporate strategy one, and what they call a commercialization one, which is basically marketing and communications. And only about a third of CMOs would call themselves in charge of enterprise value, which is just insane to me, given that that's what marketing's remit is all about. But yes, it's a cross-functional one. But we traditionally fall into certainly the latter two, and certainly the third, e.g. marketing and communication. So we should own all of it. And that's how we demonstrate our ability to drive margin, which is the ultimate health metric of a business.
And you know what, Terry, I think that's an actually really salient point. I think it's very difficult as a C-suite executive to be a subject matter expert across all of those different disciplines. I mean, even if you were the smartest person in the world, I just don't think you'd have the mental load to be able to handle all of the information and all the decision making that needs to happen across those different cross-functional teams. But I do think this idea of kind of being that vision maker and integrator is such a really powerful one, you know, taking what the CEO's vision is and saying, well, how does all of this work across all of these different siloed parts of the business? And ultimately, how do we interweave this idea of brand, marketing, and performance into the ethos of each of these different areas? So in my mind, you know, going back to what we were discussing about, you know, what they really should be owning, in my mind, I think it's this integration idea, right? Of like, how do we integrate all of these complex areas into a place, into one system, whether it's a dashboard, whether it's a CDP platform? How do we think about the integration across all of these silos into a place that can allow us to distill very salient and poignant information that we can then make business decisions from? And it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, right? When we work with these really large enterprise companies, you know, you speak to the data science team and they have one view, and then you speak to the marketing team and they have another, then you talk to the creative team, and then God forbid you have to talk to the agency and explain all of this to them. So it becomes a bit of a nightmare. Anyway, so on that note, what do you think the fundamental disconnect is between CMOs and board members? You brought this up a bit earlier in terms of having to convince the board, right? And really get their point across or explain the value creation that they're bringing. I'd love for any insight that you could share with us on kind of what you might see as kind of some of those disconnects.
Yes. Risk appetite and marketing and CMOs being in a different fundamental place, philosophical place than those folks. We're about taking risks. They are about mitigating and averting risks is I think challenge disconnect number one. Number two is that builds into sort of the disconnect on KPIs, right? Like, again, if we took a poll, and there was there's a synthetic research outfit called Evidenza, and they did a poll of quote unquote CMOs, and asked if the KPIs were aligned with finance and the C-suite. And not surprisingly, most were not. Like, we were in different places. So are we really aligned to growth, price, risk drivers of value, or are we in more opaque, attribution, the 3Ms and sort of vanity metrics? That then leads to the fundamental disconnect of a lack of trust, right? Which is different KPIs, different philosophies on risk and how you grow leads to this notion that like no one is being trusting, such that relationship is tenuous, which goes back to your point about the short tenure of a CMO. And that for me, all funnels down to this, like, we, again, going back to the beginning part of our conversation, haven't proved the value that we actually contribute to an organization. And I think some of that is because we went from the John Wanamaker, we don't know how we're spending and the value, the return on 50% of our investment, to suddenly going, we can determine the future and everything that happens if you give us $1. And that trust is further eroded because you can't predict the future. No one can. No one in finance can. We can't expect agencies to, right? But we've gotten into this, like, we want a seat at the kids' table at Thanksgiving. I'm sorry, at the adult table at Thanksgiving. But we have gone about it by saying, we're going to determine every outcome and every dollar that you give to us, when in fact, we should be taking a step back and saying, hey, we're in the probabilistic business. We're going to make really strong, educated guesses about moving consumer perception and behavior, which ultimately drive, right, revenue, margin. But like, we should not be trying to determine or guarantee the future, because we can't. And then C-suite CFOs board go, well, you guys continue to not know what you're doing. Right. And therefore we're going to cut budgets and, investment accordingly.
Do you think there's a time horizon issue? Cause that's something that I think about when I think about the boardroom, and I think about the objectives from a time perspective of each of the individuals in that room, right? CEO has to set vision, 3 to 5 years. He tends to actually stick around quite a while as well, right? Hey, I'm seeing out the vision, right? But CMO is judged on the quarter. Hey, we're down. What happened? So, the disconnect, I don't think necessarily is just about like who's responsible, but more so, how are we judging the time horizon of our investment? If you think about what you said earlier about cash flows, I'm a finance guy, right? So just want to carry on that. I'm going to start talking about standard deviation and these in a second, but you really got to think about, well, if we're trying to project out what we think this is worth, we're going to need to have alignment on what we're targeting as our projected cash flows for the future. And that involving finance, right? And then you work backwards from that and say, well, if we want to make $100 million in the next 2 years or 18 months, this is probably how much money we're going to have to spend now to achieve that result. And I think the disconnect I see a lot of the time is, number one, the target's not set because it's like, whoa, I don't know, whoa, things are happening. Oh, COVID, da, 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 da. So predicting cash flows if based on future economic cycles is very difficult to do. We all get that, right? There is a thing called the Monte Carlo simulation, which is a very technical, geeky options trading mathematical model that was built to help predict future values of companies that people do use, right? So there is the ability to be able to do it. But the disconnect, I think, is in the continuous conversation that needs to be had around, are we on track to continuously hit what we're projecting to be our numbers? And the issue we see is that it doesn't always correlate in the time span that everybody thinks it does. And it's not linear. Oh, we had a bad quarter. Q1, terrible. Q2, not bad. Q4, absolute gangbusters, right? And we're ahead of projection. And then it's Q1 of the following year, and we're one more cycle away from our final, 18-month period, and we're not going to make it. And then all of a sudden we do, right? So that unpredictability creates, I think, tension inside of the boardroom, and it creates tension across the different C-suite leaders who are constantly being evaluated on these key metrics. And I think if there was an ability, there isn't an ability because this is beautiful, hypothetical, theoretical thinking, but if there was ability to shift the mindset away from this, we have to hit the target per quarter to how did we do against our 2-year, 3-year projection, and where are the brand KPIs, performance KPIs that are showing us the trends that we can see and how we're thinking about hitting that projection, we can retroactively fit and work towards a solution. And I think that conversation needs to happen way more frequently than it probably does. And maybe it does, and maybe we're not privy to it, but I get a sneaky suspicion, especially, in that mid-sized to small SME space, it's probably not happening as frequently as it could be or should be.
Oh my God, you're preaching to the choir. Yeah, I think time horizon is a huge part of the disconnect. To your point, we are all held to quarterly earnings and growth expectations, and that leads you to overinvest in things like demand gen, performance marketing. Mm-hmm. Again, that is the harvesting of current cash flows, but neglecting, unfortunately, the future cash flows that the levers that we would have called brand. I would love to sunset that as a concept and call it long-term acquisition, right? Of of harvesting future cash flows is adopted. But with that, your point is such a good one, which is we need to think more longitudinally. Yes, at Visa, for example, we didn't do multi-year planning, which was really challenging to us to say, hey, if we think about our investments and the strategy, it is like the effects of being in market and those strategies is going to take more than 4 quarters. Mm-hmm. We should be judged and planned accordingly. But that's just not the way that corporate strategy and finance had the organization sort of plan. And so it became this like, well, how did we do this year? Well, that's a tough answer to put forth because we're still sort of in process. Mm-hmm. You being a finance guy, I would think would relate to this notion that we should, and it goes back to another part of the disconnect, adopt in marketing more finance-based models like discounted cash flow and net present value modeling and analyses. Thinking about CAPM and the arbitrage pricing theory, right? Which is about trying to understand the relationship of an investment and the profitability of an investment in the future discounted to today. That is not a quarterly thing. Mm-hmm. That is a more long-term thing. Mm-hmm. But inherent is the patience by which we can model out marketing investment and then potentially see the return. But inherent in all of that goes back to an earlier good point that you made, which is it's all about understanding risk and mitigating and trying to understand the impact of that. And all based on your very good intimation about the time value of money, right? Which is $1 today is worth more than $1 in the future based on risk and uncertainty and variability, and our inability to predict the future. But that all leads to a very conservative, relationship between finance and marketing, which is like, because you guys haven't proved out the value that you contribute to the bottom line business, we're not going to give you money, or we're going to cut money, or we don't see the efficaciousness of the money that you've been spent. So it's this amalgamation of things.
So would it be fair to say that we've become a part of the social media diet of wanting everything now, wanting it served up in the way that we want it, and we have zero time and patience, right, to see the thing, harvest the fruits of our labor?
Yes, Aaron, to build on your point about conviction and having so much empathy for CMOs, I totally agree in that, it's interesting you talked about the conviction and equating it to sort of the hard truths. And going back to this idea of being a mad scientist, we are all crazy for doing what we're doing, because in some respects, science is the search for truth. Mm-hmm. In a very practical business way, truth equals, right, revenue equals margin, right? That's the health of the business. But in our world, it's about that balance of delivering against a need state or an opportunity that drives behavior, perception, and change in our target, right? In our consumer. And so that's really challenging, given humans are by nature illogical, irrational, non-binary. Yes. In how they make decisions. And so you absolutely need that balance of the hard truth with the soft alchemy of trying to understand what drives humans, what drives their hearts and their minds. There will always be a role for us, but how do we balance that accordingly and communicate it, by the way, to the C-suite, the board, and the CFO?
Yeah. I think, having that conviction to the point about risk is, I think, some of the best examples of brands that have taken that kind of element of conviction is the staple of every brand marketing, marketing director's dream is Liquid Death. I think they've won a fantastic job of that. And they have conviction, right? But that conviction, to your point, has come with trust in, the CMO and being able to execute on these crazy daring stunts and brand positionings and statements and responses and popular culture and all of these other areas. But I think if you're willing to take the risk and you're okay with the consequences, by all means, have as much conviction as you want. But if you're not comfortable with that, then you kind of have to scale it back. And I think this is the challenge that I see a lot, which is big brand campaign is built, big agency comes in, sells you on the dream, and then all of a sudden it doesn't perform. And you might have had conviction in the very beginning about the idea and the concept, and you had all the data to back it up, and then it blew, right? It tanked. And the challenge that I see that we really embrace as an agency is this idea that, like, you don't have to continue to keep doing things that way, right? You don't have to do the one big TV spot and pray or wish and dream whether it's going to be a success. You can do the big idea and then condense that into so many other different formats of content. You can bring in so many other tastemakers and cultural icons and methods and formats, influencer, creator content, branded content, performance content. And so, I think CMOs in general have to evolve the way that they think about saving the business, rescuing the business, investing in the business. And I think all of the clever stuff that's now happening with AI and technology is the aha moment where people can go, oh, like, actually, you know what? Maybe we don't need to do that massive project anymore. Maybe we could be a bit smarter about how we go to market, or maybe we do want to have conviction in this idea, but if it doesn't work, we're going to pivot to X, Y, and Z, right? And we're going to make that work for ourselves. One thing that we did, and this is definitely a bit of self-promo, but I think it's super relevant and contextual to this information, was we were working with Birkenstock, and they came to us with a really unique solution, challenge, which was, we're selling like gangbusters in retail running stores and specialty stores, but we don't know why. And, we started off doing our GWI, media data place surveying, Nielsen, ComScore, all the crazy data analytics stuff on the quant side. And then we actually went, well, we're going to do some qual as well. We're going to do both. We spoke to the store owners and we spoke to the store associates. And what we found was the reason why they were selling like gangbusters wasn't because specialty stores are where people want to buy the product. It's because when you go for a really long run and you're a runner, you need new shoes. You're constantly burning out of sneakers. But what's happening is your feet are getting beat up, right? If you're an ultra marathon runner, your feet are an absolute mess after a run. And so the store associates realized that selling a Birkenstock shoe after a run would be a really great way, number one, for them to increase their value, because now they're making more commissions on the sales. But number two, they can educate their consumer and target audience about foot recovery. And so we took that one anecdotal piece of information and built one of the most successful brand campaigns purely targeted at ultra marathon and fun runners. And we sold a clog, technically not a running shoe, to runners, because we knew that they were going to buy this product because their feet kill after a run. So there's really clever things that can be done that aren't needing to be mass market, that can talk to really unique needs of these consumers. And if you're at the forefront of being able to find out what those insights are and generate your marketing campaigns around them, you really have a unique ability to tell a very different story, but also do it in a much more effective way.
Yeah. Can I put a finer point on that?
Yeah.
I love the case and I love the story because it actually goes back to one of the very first things that we were talking about at the beginning of this, which is, what is our remit? Our remit is to drive value for a company. You do it through growth, profit, risk. What you did through a wonderful insight and surgical segmentation is you drove acquisition, right, amongst a population that probably wasn't in isn't in the perceived market, right? So you're driving growth.
Correct.
And then the third thing you're doing from a risk perspective, which is really interesting, is you created what folks call sort of an unexpected outcome, which is an unexpected revenue opportunity.
Correct.
Right? Like brilliant on both fronts. And it was all because they came to you with a pretty specific problem or challenge. Mm-hmm. And you're like, all right, well, I'm going to pull these two, I'm going to North Star against these two levers. Yeah. And it did wonderful things for the business. It's like, I hope you submit for an Effie, because you guys should.
Hopefully, yeah. No, we did win some awards from that, but
awesome.
we're not the award-winning seekers. No. Yeah, everybody else is, unfortunately, or fortunately for us. This is kind of leading us to a natural progression into kind of what you've been up to and some of the things that you were up to at Visa. We'd love to, without getting yourself into too much trouble, get a good sense of, what the marketing contribution was to the business. And we'd love to hear from you just, firsthand what you thought they did right.
Yeah. So I did a 12-year stint at Visa and I loved it. I was very fortunate to, do a bunch of different roles, first starting in global brand and then moving into launching something called Visa Checkout, which was our digital wallet. And then moved over and ran sort of US consumer marketing for the last, 7-8 years. I think what they did right was they were aware enough to go, we need to do a better job tying the activities and investment of marketing to the business, or the attempts to try. Mm-hmm. And over, the 12 years I was there were constant efforts, resources, staff and FTE dedicated to try and better establish the correlation and really the causation between what we did. The challenging thing is the business model that Visa exists under, which is it's a B2B2C model. Let me explain. We're not a credit card company. We are the payment rails by which transactions occur. So we don't set interest rates. We don't collect. We don't actually issue the cards. That's done by what we call issuers, like banks, like Citi and Wells and Chase, Capital One, et cetera. So they issue the cards. Consumers or customers, B2B customers use them. We facilitate the transactions, the payment, the movement of money. It then gets settled at the merchants when you buy sneakers or you buy, et cetera. So that's the model by which we operate. We are not a credit card, which is interesting because we've built our equity over the last 60 years on that misattribution. If I'm being honest, the ways in which we got it right have been trying again to try the notion of equity to what we would call payment volume, which is the transactions, the number of, and we do trillions of those on an annual basis, which turns into basis points, which turns into revenue for the company. Mm-hmm. So we've done a very good job going. We believe that equity is driven by these sets of attributes, things like preference and badge value and trust, and right, there's a litany of them. I think there are 15 or 25 of them. If we can move the attributes of brand equity, it has a correlating effect on payment volume and therefore basis points, et cetera. So that's all from a consumer standpoint, right? And so we've done a reasonably good job trying to unpack the relationship between those two things in a very complicated model that we exist in, right? So job 1A of marketing is to drive usage of cards and digital wallets from a consumer perspective, because that'll impact revenue. Mm-hmm. The other interesting thing is because we are that multi-party model, we use marketing to strengthen the relationships that we have with issuers, banks, and merchants, the acquirers, which is why we, spend so much and are big supporters of big tent sponsorships like the World Cup and the Olympics, historically the NFL, et cetera, because sponsoring those things, those properties, allow us to generate awareness for consumers and clients, right? Which have a knock-on effect of driving the strength of the equity, which goes back to your point about price elasticity and sustained pricing power. And we are able to sort of pass through some of those rights to those properties to our clients to use on their own to drive things like acquisition and their own sustainable pricing power. So it all works in sort of a flywheel. So I think those are the things we got right. You didn't ask, but I'm going to give you the answer anyway. The things that we got wrong or we continue to sort of struggle with are those certifiable causation between a dollar put into marketing and what's the return. I do think that there is a better, and this goes back to what makes a CMO stand out, that there's a continued opportunity to educate the finance in the C-suite on the actual contributions that we can make, because we struggle, as you pointed out, with lots of other brands who in this environment are seeing budgets compromised and looked at with a scalpel, because we can't see those direct impact of our investment. And so they take it to the bottom line, right? We take it to the bottom line to prop up, EPS and some of those other financials that we report out. So.
Got it. So what would you say then on that note, things that we should be looking at, metrics, that could be used over time, or signals? What are some of the things that you think we could be thinking about from an attribution perspective that maybe they're not?
Yeah, I build on something you pointed out earlier, which is I think we need to think more longitudinally about this. So we should hold ourselves accountable and sync with finance on growth KPIs like acquisition and lifetime value. We should be looking at signing up for profit KPIs, right? Which is, are we able to, in certain environments, and it goes in some ways back to your Birkenstock case, which I think is a wonderful one, about sustained pricing power. Can we reduce price elasticity, increase the price of a product, right, without losing customers, and you'll see a margin increase? Conversely, can you increase sustained pricing power in a way that decreases your cost of goods sold because suppliers are either willing to work with you at a discount because your equity is so strong and they benefit from that? We see that at Visa in terms of fintechs wanting to work with us because we're Visa, because we are the most trusted brand in payments, right? Or to your earlier point, if you're more efficient at your marketing spend, you're, by virtue of doing that, decreasing your COGS to begin with, which increases your margin. So we should be signing up for things, very tangible finance-based things like acquisition and lifetime value, pricing, which affects profit, and then using some of the finance modeling and tools like DCF and net present value and CAPM and APT to try and prove out earnings stability in the future, and doing some tests associated with, investment modeling that way. None of those things, I would say none of those things. I don't know for the audience if they're all doing it and I'm just the last guy to to become aware, or if we're not really having those conversations because we're still busy, proving out the short-termism of attribution and marketing mix modeling, and neglecting sort of the longitudinal point that you made at the beginning of this, which is we need to be thinking about this in a different time horizon.
I totally agree with the sentiment and pretty much everything that you were saying. I think, I can't speak from the brand side. I can give you the perspective on agency, which is, let's be honest, I think there's been a ton of inefficiency, right? Inefficiency across media spend, principal media buying, which is a whole other conversation, overstaffed teams. And now there's been a realization of well, hang on a second, we might not need all of this the way that we did in the past. And so I feel, to kind of conclude in this not all doom idea, that it's really a good opportunity to have clarity, right? To have better insights, better creative work, and more outcomes and decision-based frameworks that allow us to actually tie things back to attribution and value. And so I think it's a really hard time if you've been a faker, right? If you've been faking it, you've been BSing your way through this for quite some time. Now, unfortunately, is your time. The curtain's coming down and it's over for you.